Theology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View. And certainly throughout the program today, we're going to be talking about a number of issues. Robert Knight will be with us as we talk about a piece that he has posted in the Washington Times. Chris Reese with us, who's also posted some great articles over the years at the Christian Worldview Bulletin, and some articles about international law and the rest. But it did seem to me that we need to focus for at least a few minutes on the shooting in Minnesota, the ICE shooting in Minnesota. And first of all, what comes to mind is a conversation we had months ago with Heather McDonald, who has, of course, been covering some of the ICE incidents. At the time, she had covered some in California. And she was expressing the fear, which we hope would not happen, but now has, of someone will be shot, someone will lose their life, someone will get run over, somebody will get caught between two vehicles, whatever it might be, whether it was intentional, accidental. And then, of course, all sorts of things would break out. And, of course, if you are even anywhere close to the news in Minnesota, it has gone crazy, because you are now, of course, having individuals that have been surrounding the federal building there in Minneapolis. The decision was made, and I want to get to this in just a few minutes, to close the Minneapolis schools. And again, first of all, that has nothing to do with what's happening on the ground, but again, almost intended to ratchet up some of the conflict. And of course, if the students aren't in school, will some of them also show up at the rallies and the protests and the rest? So there is a lot to say. I will be the first to admit that I sometimes frustrate you as listeners in the fact that I sort of postpone making too many comments about an incident until we know more. Because it turns out that some of the incidents, even if we have them on tape, don't give the full story. We're learning a lot more about this shooting that took place. And so I thought, well, we do need to talk about it. But I did find a very good piece, which, again, Karen very quickly posted, by Charles Cook. Charles Cook is somebody we quote with some regularity, but I like how he positions this. Even though we don't know everything, we know what not to think about, because he titles his piece, How Not to Think About the ICE Shooting in Minnesota. He says, I'm not entirely sure what I think about what happened in Minnesota yesterday. On balance, I think that the ICE officer likely legally justified in his actions. Even I wish it had turned out differently, but I'm always open to counter arguments. Goes on to, especially with the emergence of new evidence. And how many times have I seen and heard various people rush to the microphones with inadequate or even false information? So there is a wisdom in many cases of saying, maybe we wait till we know a little bit more. Of course, all the people that are surrounding that federal building aren't waiting for more information. They've already made up their mind. But he does give us a list of some things that have been said by both left and right that are not right. There are just a few things that we can at least agree we should not be saying and are not accurate. And so I thought for just a minute I would run through some of his. And if you would like to read his justification for each one, it is our first article today on the website, pointofview.net. First one he lists is ICE executed or ICE assassinated a peaceful protester. Again, Charles Cook says that's not true. Certainly one can watch the various videos and come to different conclusions, but none of these conclusions can be that the deceased was executed or assassinated. And, of course, if you've been watching it, are well aware of the fact that the officer opened fire when the car was going to back over him or had backed over him, and we'll get to that second one in just a minute. The second, the deceased didn't deserve to be killed. This is true in a cosmic sense. In the abstract, we would not impose the death penalty on a person who blocked traffic, resisted arrest, tried to run over somebody. We certainly did not want that for Ashley Babbitt, since we were talking just about 5 years ago, an individual that was shot in the Capitol, but nevertheless did not deserve to be killed. Number 3, knowing what we know, the officer. And again, he says this is also not a useful way to think about what happened. We have lots of different angles, the testimony of eyewitnesses, the ability to slow down the footage frame by frame. Of course, we also know a little bit more about the individual who was shot. We know a little bit more about the individual who did the shooting, and that maybe weighs in a little bit as well. A couple more. The deceased violently, willfully, and viciously ran over the ICE officer. That's not true. And Mr. President, it is not helpful to make those kinds of statements either. It's probable that the officer was hit by the car, and if so, that adds weight to the decision to open fire. Again, we don't necessarily know all the details, but they're certainly coming in pretty quickly. He says still it's not at all clear that this was willful, and while being hit by a car is always violent, the characterization of the collision as violence is hyperbolic, and I can go on and on, but you can read the rest of that piece there as well. 3 more just before we take a break. The deceased was just a 37-year-old lady in a Honda Pilot. This line is obviously intended to juxtapose the armed male ICE officer with the unarmed female civilian victim, and therefore make the latter seem less of a threat. But it's absurd. This wasn't a bar fight. A Honda Pilot weighs over 4,000 pounds that respond to an accelerator identically regardless of the strength of the person controlling it. The driver could have been a mother or a retiree or Mike Tyson, or it could be a computer or a variety of other things that could have caused that. And so, again, that is the way you will see many of these news reports try to play on your emotions. Another one, this could have happened to anyone. How many times have we heard that? No, it couldn't. This is the bizarre cousin, he says, of the executed line. A lightning strike could happen to anyone. This incident could not have. The deceased was there in her car, did not make her death legitimate, but it did not more likely mean that if she had not been there in the car. She was not chosen at random. You hear this all the time when somebody gets shot by the police. They say, well, this could happen to anyone. No, only the people that shoot at the police, only those people that disobey a willful and legal justifiable order, and on and on and on. Anyway, we'll go through that. One last one. I shouldn't have been there in the first place. Again, he says this is nonsense. We have a lot of duly passed immigration laws in the United States, and the duly elected head of the federal government is permitted, required even, to enforce them without the acquiescence of the states. A lot of that has to do with, of course, the hatred of Donald Trump. As I mentioned the other day, there's at least one article out right now in Atlantic arguing that if you actually do a comparison, this is by a person that did not like Trump because he was criticizing Trump by saying he's really not doing that much in deportation, even though he claimed to, because more people were deported under Biden and Obama during the same period of time. I don't know if it's true, but it illustrates there wasn't just a lot of protest when we have the deportations under Obama and Biden. Look at the protests now. Anyway, it's a very good piece. Charles Cook really took the time to at least help us understand how not to think about the ICE shooting in Minnesota. When we come back, I'll talk about a few other aspects of what's happening in Minneapolis. We'll take a break. Be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The Trump administration is sending confusing messages concerning federal drug policy. Last month, President Trump signed an executive order that declared fentanyl was a weapon of mass destruction. Although the phraseology may be extreme and misleading, the intent is appropriate. The CDC estimates that at least 300,000 Americans have died due to fentanyl and other related synthetic opioids. 3 days later, President Trump signed another executive order that reclassified marijuana from a Schedule I drug to a Schedule III drug. This action significantly loosened federal regulations and reduced criminal penalties. Tony Perkins of the Family Research Council called the president's drug policy incoherent. He said the federal government is waging a shooting war against drug traffickers in the Caribbean while simultaneously decriminalizing marijuana and normalizing its use at home. It's worth mentioning that nearly 24 members of Congress urged the president not to reclassify marijuana. Several of the signatories were physicians who understand the issue of drug use. In previous commentaries, I've mentioned the numerous studies that found significant abnormalities in important brain structures in casual users. These abnormalities in the working memory of your brain affect judgments, decisions, and plannings. Numerous studies found significant and consistent association between consumption of marijuana and the later development of schizophrenia. This is the interesting irony. At a time when states and now the federal government are willing to declassify marijuana as a harmful and addictive drug, we are now discovering major concerns with marijuana use. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of genetic engineering, go to viewpoints.info/genetic engineering. Viewpoints.info/genetic engineering. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again with just a few more comments about Minneapolis and Minnesota. Then we'll move on to, of course, the article I have on international law. I'll postpone maybe some of the others a little bit later. At the bottom of the hour, our good friend Robert Knight, 13, or in one place it says 14 good things that happened in 2025. Are you ready for some good news? I am. Although sometimes his good news is by talking about something negative that didn't happen. But that, I think, is one of the reasons I wanted to focus on that. We've talked about media bias before with Robert Knight, and sometimes the most significant media bias is when you don't cover the story or you don't tell the rest of the story. So sometimes the bias goes the wrong direction where you misinform your readers or viewers, but sometimes bias by just simply not covering it. And he will talk about a number of things that in some respects deserve some attention, and the legacy press didn't provide them, so he did. And as a person that's worked with the Los Angeles Times, as an individual that's worked with Media Research Center, and a variety of other organizations, I think he's done a very good job. But real quickly, the question that I think is deserving of an answer, and this comes from our friend Jim Garrity, is why did Minneapolis close the public schools today and Friday? Again, this is a tragedy. The shooting of a woman, the shooting by an ICE officer. But the argument that we should close the schools is, I think, really significant, and it illustrates again how the Minneapolis mayor, Jacob Frey, really just wants to ratchet up, I suspect, some of this. Now, the argument is, out of an abundance of cautions, there will be no school on Thursday, January 8th, and Friday, January 9th, due to safety concerns related to today's incident around the city. Okay, seriously? As sad as this is, it has zero effect on teachers and students. And yet it is, I think, a good illustration. And Jim Garrity raises some good questions. First of all, you've got to understand that we have been told that students deserve to be in the schools. He reminds us that the former Vice President, Kamala Harris, when she was the Attorney General of the state of California, believed that kids belonged in school and prosecuted parents of truant children. As a matter of fact, sometimes there are attempts to prosecute parents who homeschool their children. Liberty McCarter shared how her mother was put in jail and her sister was being homeschooled. And so you can begin to see that this is kind of the argument. And you have to honestly ask, what are the safety concerns here? Are we fearing that there's going to be riots in the schools? Are anti-ICE protests getting that violent? And certainly around the federal building, yes, that's probably true. Is this some sort of nonsense that teachers and students are afraid to go to school for fear of being shot by ICE agents? These are just a few of the questions that Jim Garrity raises. And in case you wonder, well, it's just a one-off, it's not that big a deal, we are talking about in the Minneapolis Public School District. 98 schools, 29,000, almost 30,000 students over an area of roughly 59 square miles. And the city can't guarantee the safety of any student in any of those schools. And again, it does not pass what I oftentimes call the straight face test. I don't know how you can say that with a straight face, but nevertheless, that is the case. Jeffrey Behar, one I like to quote from him every once in a while, and of course he always likes to lampoon. He goes after everybody from Donald Trump to Tim Walz, and in this particular case, though, he has expressed a level of anxiety and frustration that maybe you can agree with. I won't read the title of his piece, but you can kind of get the sense that he's done with Minnesota. I'll leave it at that. He uses some words I won't use on the air. He says, "I'm simply done with Minnesota overall. It keeps resurfacing in the national news like a bad penny. Well, Donald Trump just banned pennies. Can he ban Minnesota via executive order as well? I'm not a superstitious man, but I suspect it's time to write their experiment in statehood off as a loss and revert it to non-voting territorial status, or maybe trade it to Canada for Alberta plus a province to be named later on." Because the point he's making is, and I think we've all had enough of Minnesota, haven't you? I mean, from the governor Tim Walz to the attorney general to some of the members of Congress, as well as the scandals that we've been talking about now in terms of primarily Somali, but not exclusively, individuals that have been involved in some of the greatest fraud in the history of this country, to now this issue. And then the mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Fry, saying I should get, and again using words we won't use on radio, to get out of Minneapolis, and on and on and on. And the statements by Tim Walz, who, by the way, decided the other day he was not going to run for re-election. I think I maybe share his concern, and maybe you do as well, that this state needs to get itself in order very quickly. There are just seemingly problems that surface out of Minnesota every single day. And I think it's just beginning to be too much. Let's, if we can, real quickly mention that my first article, and now it has now become my second article, just as an attempt real quickly to address this issue of international law. I may postpone some of it to Friday just because we'll have two lawyers sitting around the table. But as the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal pointed out, international law almost seems like it's become a tyrant's best friends. Democrats and foreign leaders are claiming that the arrest of Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro is illegal. Of course, you've had comments, and he gives them from China, a clear violation, Russia, an act of armed aggression, and the one, again, that's hard to say with a straight face, Hamas even had a comment about this is the assault on the sovereignty of an independent state. This is Hamas, which actually entered into Israel and killed so many individuals. But nevertheless, he said it would be nice, and the editor said it would be nice to think we live in a Wilsonian garden where law governs relations among nations. We don't. The closest we've come was in the aftermath of the Cold War, when the United States was the dominant nation globally and rallied coalitions to enforce international norms in the first Gulf War and the Balkans. Today, rogue regimes are on the march, and international law and institutions that supposedly uphold it end up protecting the lawbreakers. And so, again, he says it's unwise, of course, to get rid of all of international law. But this particular article does a very good job of taking the UN Charter, and we're talking about Article 2, Section 4 of the UN Charter, and pointing out that this particular argument being made makes no sense. First, is the U.S. intervention a violation of Venezuelan sovereignty when the legitimate authority consents to it? You'd say, who is that? Well, that would be Edmundo Gonzalez. Remember, I told you that in 2024, he won 68% of the vote and yet was declared the loser, and that Nicolas Maduro supposedly won in a close election. But Edmundo Gonzalez, who is the actual and should be the actual president of Venezuela, has spoken in support of the operation. Also, of course, Maduro has welcomed Hezbollah Cuban troops. We know that because there were 32 Cubans who were the bodyguards, apparently, of Maduro that all died while trying to defend him. And second, they argue, does this qualify as U.S. self-defense against the Venezuelan regime's drug smuggling and use of migration as a weapon? The U.S. also claimed self-defense as its grounds to arrest Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega, 1989. Of course, he was taken to captivity in 1990. So again, the reality is, as much as we would like international law to inhibit tyrants, it's just not. China's not waiting to figure out if we could get a better interpretation of international law to take Taiwan. Russia didn't wait to see if they maybe needed to get approval from the international community to go into Ukraine. You know the answer to this. They conclude by saying the only defense against global rogues is the deterrent of Western military force. Just think of what the world would be like right now if there was not a United States that could protect you from the ravages of Russia, China, North Korea, if we still would allow individuals who intend our destruction to just simply be as close as 2 hours away on a plane flight. There are some important issues. I know everybody says it's all about oil, and I think that's maybe part of it, but mostly about not having the oil go to China. But it's about a lot of other things. And again, they refer to this as the international law illusion in Venezuela. It's a piece that we've posted today. We might spend some time talking about it tomorrow since we have two lawyers. But when we come back, going to spend some time with our good friend Robert Knight. Some good things that happen in 2025. That coming up right after this.
Have you ever met a child you knew would do great things? They displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, and a zest for learning. Now imagine someone takes that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, they feed them nothing but lies. You know, that scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from the mainstream media and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Well, we've been talking about Minnesota. We've been talking about international law. We've been talking about Venezuela, and certainly much more we could talk about. But one of the things we have learned over the years, and we've even talked about this with Robert Knight, our next guest, is that oftentimes media bias comes not from what the media say, but what they ignore. And so I thought it would be good to actually talk about good things that happened in 2025. One of the articles says 13 things, good things that happened in 2025. One says 14. In a minute, we'll talk about the 14th one, which is kind of a joke. But whether we look at the baker's dozen or more, lots of things to cover in that regard. Robert Knight, of course, is a good friend of this ministry. He's an author, weekly columnist for the Washington Times. We've posted this article, which actually came out in December. His most recent one is on the Minnesota welfare scandal, which we might talk about in just a minute. Former news editor with the Los Angeles Times, also had been a media fellow with the Hoover Institute, Institute, and a variety of others, senior fellow at STAND, Staying True to America's National Destiny, and much more. We have a link to his website, roberthknight.com. Don't have to remember all that because the link is already there, and you'll find some of his articles, his books, and if you'd like to have him come and speak, that would be the case. But Robert, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, Happy New Year, Kirby.
Happy New Year. Boy, we have a lot to talk about. I'm sure you get the comment all the time that I get, and that is people come up to me and say, well, you don't have to wonder about what to talk about. I mean, Minnesota alone is kept us busy. Jeffrey Blahar said, he's just done with Minnesota, whether it's the scandal or whether it's, of course, the shooting we talked about earlier and all sorts of other issues. There is a lot to talk about, but let's get back to your article for just a few minutes because I posted it because oftentimes we don't hear the good news, and oftentimes we'll have you on or Gary Bauer will talk about the bad news, but you've got at least 13 good things that happen in 2025, and the first, which I hadn't even thought about, Christmas is still a big deal, and there was a time not so long ago when that was not the case.
Yeah, I think President Trump would put it this way: that last year was huge because so much happened,
Yes.
and you'd never know it from the mainstream media. And I list things not in a particular order, except starting with Christmas. I mean I wrote this around Christmas time, so
Yes,
I thought the
makes
birth
sense.
of Jesus is
Yeah.
no small thing. And I heard Merry Christmas all over the place. I heard clerks saying it to customers, and just a couple of years ago, people were afraid to say that. It was all Happy Holidays.
That's
and I
right.
thought, well, people feel freer now.
And what's
that's
interesting is a
good-
lot of yours are kind of cultural issues and not political ones. But let's talk politics for a minute. White House is doing great things. And I said before, whether you like Donald Trump or not, and I hear from both sides in terms of emails and all the rest, you've got to admit one thing. I mean, the White House and this administration has done something I've never seen before. You and I have been around for a while, and we've seen some where it's been maybe the first 100 days, maybe some things get accomplished, but I have never seen such movement on so many different fronts simultaneously coming out of the Oval Office. Have you?
No, it's dizzying. There's so many, and they're all good. If you look at, I just kind of summarized and said the White House is doing great things, and Donald Trump has been reversing hundreds of bad policies. Let me give you an example I didn't cite in the column, and that's where he pushed back on the Biden era fuel standards,
Right.
and which California was using to require things like 18-wheel trucks to be all electric within a few years, which would have been a disaster because it takes a long time to fire them up, and they're very expensive, which would raise prices and so on. So California's had to reverse that because that's no longer viable. He just that alone, overcoming the crazy Biden energy policies has done wonders. Another thing is that judge after judge that Trump has appointed has been issuing constitutionally sound rulings, as opposed to the ones appointed by Barack Obama and Joe Biden and Clinton before them. In fact, I edit a lot of things, and when I see a crazy judicial decision, I look and research who appointed them, and it's almost always Obama or Biden that have come up with a terrible decision.
Well, let's see if we can. Another one, of course, former Vice President Kamala Harris, nowhere near the Oval Office. Let's add Tim Walz to it. Can you imagine right now Kamala Harris with, of course, we wouldn't be in Venezuela, probably wouldn't have ICE. We'd be learning now, maybe after the fact, about the Vice President, Tim Walz's inattention to some details up in Minnesota. I mean, just think about how different that Oval Office would be given the one we have right now.
Oh yeah, they were behind every radical left-wing policy you can imagine. That was the most radical ticket in history, and the fact that they even got that close to the Oval Office is scary. And now that you've seen Minnesota blow up, and it was under Tim Walz for years, you see what they might have done to the rest of the country.
Wow!
But along those lines, Walz is the one who ordered the public schools to put tampons in the boys' rooms. because after all, boys can have times of the month. So, that's how crazy he is. But the good news, and that's another item, is that the transgender overreach is getting a major pushback. Many European nations.
I didn't see that 2 years ago. I wondered if we were headed down a road that would not have a U-turn, but that has changed dramatically, hasn't it?
It really has. It's unsustainable. Giving dangerous drugs, hormones, and surgeries to kids, to me, is a form of child abuse, and it's being recognized as such. This was pushed without any evidence that it was good for anybody, and people were afraid to oppose it because then they'd be accused of being homophobic and so on. But the Europeans kind of led the way, and they said, you know what, this is hurting kids. We're not allowing hospitals to do this anymore. And now that has been the case in the United States. And I think it's 25 states now have banned transgender treatments on kids. All of those states are run by Republicans. And all the states that haven't banned it are run by Democrats. And this should be a major issue still. President Trump made the most of it in 2024, but I think it's an ongoing thing that the Democrats are embracing a battle against nature itself and insisting on that boys can be girls and vice versa.
Well, again, you mentioned the word case. That's very similar to the Cass review, which was in the UK on transgenderism. And it's interesting that first, as you point out, Europe has begun to back away from that. We now have a Secretary of Health and Human Services that is also looking at some of those initial studies that weren't necessarily scientifically accurate, but were used to justify that. And so you've just seen a remarkable reversal and pushback on the issue of transgender. Let's pick out at least another one. America's border is secure. Again, I thought maybe we would see a decline. That made some sense. I didn't think we'd get to the point where you could actually have the Border Patrol report 0 catch and release. Didn't see that coming, and yet that happened in 2025, even if the mainstream press didn't cover it a whole lot.
Yeah, remember when the Democrats were saying, well, we just can't do anything unless Congress passes some more laws. And that was nonsense. It's an executive function to protect the border of the United States. And as soon as President Trump got in the Oval Office, he signed a number of executive orders that effectively shut down the border. And it shut down this huge flow that Joe Biden had permitted for years, allowing anywhere from 6 to 10 million people to flood into the country. Most of them, the vast majority, unvetted. It was a disaster, and Trump quickly put an end to that. But, you don't see that issue in the press anymore because for two reasons. One, it was so successful, it's not news anymore. And two, the Democrats don't want to be reminded that they made a mess of it before Trump came along. Another story you don't see anymore was maybe the most important thing that happened in 2025, and that's President Trump taking out Iran's nuclear facilities.
Right.
That hung over the world, this threat that this Islamic regime that is the main sponsor of terrorism in the world was going to acquire a nuclear weapon. They're getting closer and closer to it. And past presidents had talked about it, and Trump went ahead and said, you know what, we're going to bomb it. We're going to work with Israel, and we're going to take these facilities out. And he did it.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll continue talking about a few more of those stories that were good things that happened in 2025. When you look at that, you can think about Hamas, its shadow of its former self, Hezbollah. I don't think many of those people want to actually look at their phones or BlackBerries anymore. Of course, Iran and a variety of others that have changed the nature of the Middle East. And we've also, of course, talked about what's been happening in this country. We have many more to talk about. If you find yourself wanting to maybe look at that list created by Robert Knight, simply go to the website pointofview.net and you can print it out for yourself and maybe pass it around to others. We'll take a break, be back with more right after this.
You're listening to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again with Robert Knight, talking about good things that happened in 2025. Just to keep it moving, Robert, let's talk about military recruitment is way up. Best performance in 15 years. Again, a few years ago, wouldn't have seen that coming. But again, add to that, of course, two very successful military operations. You mentioned the one to Iran. Let's mention the other one of the capture of Nicolas Maduro. Flawless in both cases. And you and I are old enough to remember when Jimmy Carter tried to rescue the hostages, and that didn't go so well. So there is a reason, I think, for the recruitment being up, and part of that has to do with maybe restoring what's called the warrior culture.
Yeah, the military had been overtaken by the woke virus, and a lot of the people that the military depends on come out of traditional families, many of whom are military families, and they did not like what they were seeing, and that was their young recruits were being subjected to hazing over politically correct stances on transgenderism and the whole LGBTQ culture, and as soon as Trump was elected, and he said he'd put an end to this, and he appointed Pete Hegseth, Secretary of War, he immediately signed orders doing away with all that stuff and made it all about defending the country and becoming the strongest military force on the planet again. And that inspired a lot of young people to sign up, say, hey, that's for me.
Well, again, just incredible series of numbers. One that I thought was interesting, tragedy with a silver lining. Of course, the killing of Charlie Kirk, and that happened on September 10th. But also, of course, seeing the response at the Turning Point USA's Amerifest. More than 140,000 people submitted requests to join, bringing a membership to over 1 million people. I was in a meeting this morning. We were talking about doing kind of a open forum where we would begin to answer questions on this one campus. And then somebody said, well, fortunately, on that campus, they have a Turning Point chapter. And I said, oh, that's good, because thought we'd have to do it all by ourselves. But now we can kind of join arms with them as we're on campus, letting people ask any tough question they'd like to ask about some of the issues in the Bible. So that has changed rather dramatically, even though, of course, it came as a result of a great tragedy.
Yeah, it did. And, you better watch yourself, because there's still nutty people out there. And unfortunately, that the amount of violence now being committed by transgender individuals is far out of proportion to the number of transgender people in the country. And it's you uncover a lot of these recent and violent incidents, and the press never highlights this. They always bury it, and you find a transgender aspect, such as Charlie Kirk's killing. The accused killer had a boyfriend, and the boyfriend is undergoing transition to being a female. And the motive there is that Charlie Kirk was standing against that sort of thing, and he was a powerful voice, and that they'll have to prove in court his motive, but it looks pretty clear to me. And any number of other incidents you find out later. In the school shootings, many of them were committed by transgenders. I'm not saying this to have people say, okay, let's go against transgender. I'm saying it because it's a stubborn fact that needs explanation. I happen to think that applying young people, especially before puberty, with all these hormones and drugs and treatments, probably is resulting in some people on the edge losing it and becoming violent.
Well, another aspect of the Charlie Kirk effect, as some people called, young people going back to church. We had George Barna on here. Of course, in the past, we've had Dave Kinnaman of Barna Group and others, in which is described as a historic reversal. That's another one we didn't see coming. The trajectory always seemed like fewer and fewer in terms of percentage going to church, and that's changed a little bit with the Gen Y millennials and especially Gen Zs, haven't we?
Oh, very much so. I think it's because the culture turned so dark that the light shines ever brighter. We know how that works. And it's a time of spiritual renewal. I have made the case that we're actually in the midst of a revival.
Yes.
Maybe at the beginning, but certainly it has a feeling of that when you see the enthusiasm among these young people who were told it was uncool to go to church a few years ago, but now they're finding that this is the rebellious position to take. This is the revolutionary stance to take, is standing for Christ. That's the one that shows your bravery, your courage, your willingness to be different. So it's becoming cool to go back to church, and that is a very good thing.
What about gas prices? That's an economic issue. I think this issue of affordability will be an issue in the 2026 campaign, but right now gasoline costs less than $30 a gallon in most places, except for California, but I paid, $2.39 yesterday? Yeah, and so that's a lot less than $3 for a gallon of gasoline.
Yeah, where I am, it's below $2.40 a gallon now in Northern Virginia even. And I think it's going to keep going down because what happened was Joe Biden declared war on America's energy industry. And, within a few months, inflation soared to 9%. This was energy driven because gasoline prices went through the roof. It went up to $5 a gallon. That drives the rest of the economy. Think of all those semi trucks out on the road that deliver goods. I mean, it just, and yet, if you look at a lot of the economists said that, it was just government spending. Well, that too. I mean, they were spending trillions because of COVID and beyond. But it was really the energy that did it, because when Obama spent big, inflation was still something like 1.2%. But when Biden did it, he did it along with attacking our energy industry. And now that Trump has freed it up and America is once again leading, you see those prices streaming downward, which is a very good thing.
I might just mention we skipped over some like the stock market, Planned Parenthood. Of course, you had one called Venezuela Reeling, and that was before, of course, the taking of Nicolas Maduro. And then for those of you that love baseball as we do, Shohei Ohtani, an impossibly good slugger pitcher for the Dodgers, doing something not seen since the 1920s, and total attendance for Major League Baseball up, and a variety of other things due probably to star power and pitch clock and so many more. But I thought I just might mention, Robert, people can find this article on our website, but they can also find you. I would encourage them to look at some of your other articles or your books. Maybe they'd like to purchase them. And if they want to contact you, there's a button there where they can contact you. And I hope they might schedule you to come and speak. But if nothing else, we appreciate you being the eyes and ears for us out there in the Washington, D.C. area, and really thinking through some of these issues and writing this very good piece that appeared in the Washington Times.
Well, thank you, Kerby. It's always a pleasure being on with you, and God bless you and your listeners.
Again, if you want to know a little bit more about Robert Knight, it's roberthknight.com. Don't have to remember all that. Just click on the picture of him. If you'd like to get his article and maybe pass it around, having some people that are just saying, just nothing but bad news. They say, well, he's got 13 or 14, depending on how you want to count that last one, as good things that happen in 2025. And as you heard him mention, since he's written the piece, he's come up with a whole bunch more. So that's why we thought it would be good to cover it. One, to encourage you, and two, to remind you sometimes the news you need to know isn't really always covered by the legacy media. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover. That coming up right after this.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to spend some time looking at a couple of very important issues. First one, a little bit philosophical, but stay with me because it won't get too abstract, and I think it relates back to a couple of booklets I'm holding up. One that we did, a biblical point of view on socialism, and then the one we sent to you in December, if you're one of the Truth Team, The Road to Serfdom, which is really based upon a book by Friedrich Hayek, and really talks about, I think is probably one of the best books to critique socialism. And I use those booklets as an illustration because, after all, we have a few socialists in office, whether it is in the United States Congress, and that would be everybody from in the House of Representatives, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, to the United States Senate, Bernie Sanders, to, of course, we have a socialist in Seattle, but probably the best-known socialist right now is the mayor of New York City, Zohran Mamdani. Now, from time to time, you have a speech that a person gives that becomes so significant that sometimes the speech even outlasts the speaker, but it certainly is something that people repeat again and again. And in his particular inaugural address, New York Mayor Zohran Mamdani said, "We will replace the frigidity of rugged individualism with the warmth of collectivism." Now, of course, you've had all sorts of people attack it, criticize it, do any kind of exegetical work on it, whatever it might be. But the point he makes is that we don't really want a bunch of individuals here in America. We want to be part of the collective. Quite a number of individuals, including one individual that used to be part of our Millennial Roundtable, had pictures of what collectivism means. And of course, that's 100 million deaths during the 20th century and much more. But this piece by Stephen Solkup, I think, is a better way to respond to that. You have to respond to it in some way, because the younger you are, the more likely you are to believe that socialism is better than a free market system. Now, again, it is always amazing to me that people who enjoy the benefits of the free market system all of a sudden decide to embrace socialism because they haven't seen the consequences. Really, if you are honest with yourself, you've got to see that Venezuela shows you that. But, of course, the argument always is, well, that was socialism done incorrectly. But if you look at our booklet on socialism that I have here, I'll give you the list that was put together. Dinesh D'Souza's list is as good as any, but there are many others that are almost identical. You have about 24 different countries that have embraced socialism, and they've all been a failure. And I think part of that is back to the fact that we call this a biblical point of view on socialism, because if you believe in human nature, if you believe in human sinfulness, if you believe that people sometimes are selfish, ambitious, if they get power, they aren't really that magnanimous. So there are some real issues there. And so I think in some respects, what Stephen Sukop is trying to say is the opposite of collectivism isn't rugged individualism, it's community. And that is the case. He says, understandably and rightly so, most of the criticism of this line and its speaker is centered on its mortifying and inarguably whitewashing of the term collectivism, which has been used for the last 150 years. And it identifies Marxism, it identifies fascism, it identifies Nazism. It certainly talks about what it meant in Russia, in Germany, in Cambodia. He goes through the long list. I won't go through all those. You can read it for yourself. And he says, given all this, Zoran Mandani's use and attempted rehabilitation of the term were viewed by many observers of all political persuasions as either the height of ignorance or an expression of solidarity with a true and profound evil. But while both traditional and social media are filled with comments, he says, on and repudiations of this embrace of collectivism, what concerns me more, he says, has drawn far less rebuke is the false dichotomy he fabricates in articulating this embrace. Because essentially what he's saying is individualism isn't the opposite. As a matter of fact, he goes on to say that really radical individualism is a precursor. It's maybe the first step towards collectivism. And I love how he says that. More to the point, individualism, where it does exist, is not exactly the opposite of collectivism. If anything, radical individualism is a precursor to collectivism, one of the many steps along the proverbial road to serfdom down which collectivism leads. A link, of course, to that particular book that I mentioned in our December booklet by Friedrich Hayek. And so he then gives us a little bit of the history of the conservative ideas. And really, for that reason alone, it's worth the article, because he reminds us that after World War II, you had kind of a renaissance in this idea of conservatism. And it started in 1948 with a book that I've quoted before, but most people have never read. I still have it on my shelf, I believe. Richard Weaver's book, Ideas Have Consequences, followed then by a very good book by Russell Kirk that came out as well, that really began to identify this idea of modern age conservatism, the conservative mind. You have some others, William F. Buckley Jr., for example, God and Man at Yale, and Robert Nisbet's The Quest for Community. And then later on, you even had George Nash, The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America. And part of the argument which was being made at the time was that, if anything, we are not living in this isolated world, although, to be honest, there are in times people are lonely and isolated. But really the opposite of collectivism is community. And that, I think, is the case. He goes on to say that collectivism is truly and inarguably evil. Community, in turn, stands as rival, and really is a rival that has been somewhat deteriorating, because we need the community of church, the community of families in the neighborhood, communities of groups that are like-minded with different affinities. And he says one not need to be a post-liberal Trumper to recognize this. One only need to be aware of our human nature and our history. And so I thought it was a good piece, because we talk about this idea that we do reject the socialist idea, but sometimes when we want to put capitalism in its place, we're not talking about crony capitalism. We're not talking about something where you have this rugged individualist that is only out for himself. We recognize that even sometimes as people pursue their own self-interest, as Adam Smith said, they're led really almost by an invisible hand to bring about an end maybe they didn't intend, but it is the betterment of society. We've never really had a true free market. And so I can understand why many times students and young people say, well, I don't like the system we have right now, so I'll adopt a system that has been proven to be failure and proven to be destructive. That's socialism. And I think, if nothing else, we need to point out the fact that the opposite of collectivism is actually community. And that's really what a Christian should be for. Anyway, very good piece. Thought you might want to read it. We'll come back and get into some other issues right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The Trump administration is sending confusing messages concerning federal drug policy. Last month, President Trump signed an executive order that declared fentanyl was a weapon of mass destruction. Although the phraseology may be extreme and misleading, the intent is appropriate. The CDC estimates that at least 300,000 Americans have died due to fentanyl and other related synthetic opioids. 3 days later, President Trump signed another executive order that reclassified marijuana from a Schedule I drug to a Schedule III drug. This action significantly loosened federal regulations and reduced criminal penalties. Tony Perkins of the Family Research Council called the president's drug policy incoherent. He said the federal government is waging a shooting war against drug traffickers in the Caribbean while simultaneously decriminalizing marijuana and normalizing its use at home. It's worth mentioning that nearly 24 members of Congress urged the president not to reclassify marijuana. Several of the signatories were physicians who understand the issue of drug use. In previous commentaries, I've mentioned the numerous studies that found significant abnormalities in important brain structures in casual users. These abnormalities in the working memory of your brain affect judgments, decisions, and plannings. Numerous studies found significant and consistent association between consumption of marijuana and the later development of schizophrenia. This is the interesting irony. At a time when states and now the federal government are willing to declassify marijuana as a harmful and addictive drug, we are now discovering major concerns with marijuana use. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view of genetic engineering, go to viewpoints.info/genetic engineering. Viewpoints.info/genetic engineering. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, I'm going to an article right now by Kevin McCullough. He's been on the program with us before. He is also a radio talk show host with the Salem Radio Network, and he has a very good piece that came out the other day. We want our money back. Have you felt that feel a little bit? Yes, of course, when we just earlier talked about what's happened in Minnesota, we want our money back. I mean, really? And we heard from when Doge was allowed to function for a short period of time before they were essentially run out of town, we said, we want our money back. I mean, this is just unbelievable, the amount of waste, fraud, and abuse. And then to have individuals in government in certain states, and it's been worse in some states than others. It's been worse in certain federal programs than others. It's been worse in certain state programs than others. But nevertheless, it's just unbelievable amount of waste, fraud, and abuse. We've talked about this before. We'll get into it as well. But there's a second angle to this that Kevin McCullough takes on, and that is he starts by saying the American taxpayer is the most abused investor on the planet. He says we fund the largest government in human history. That's true. Just think about this for a minute. When people say, well, I think we need to make the government bigger. Really? This is the biggest government we've ever had in the history of this planet, and you want to make it bigger. Okay. Yet for decades, we've been told by both parties, and he's critical of both Republicans and Democrats here, that competence must be rationed. Now, what does he mean? One administration handles domestic policy while foreign policy implodes. The next administration plays global chess while Americans drown in inflation, crime, and bureaucratic neglect. And he says the era has been exposed. Now, let's just recognize for a minute that there has been a debate that came out of really the 1970s when Jimmy Carter was president of whether or not the presidency was just too big for any one individual, because you have domestic policy and you have foreign policy. And of course, you also have some of the requirements of also state dinners and everything else. They've oftentimes said we'd be better if we had a king or a queen that could do the state dinners while everybody else does the politics. And, of course, there's always been this push and pull between, well, if I focus on domestic policy, will I neglect international policy? So, or if I focus on foreign policy, will I neglect domestic policy? And then sometimes we've elected individuals who did not have expertise in both. And so you can see, I'll use George W. Bush as an example. Who did he pick as his vice president? Dick Cheney, who ostensibly, and I think actually, had quite a bit of expertise in the area of foreign policy because of all the time he'd served in government. Then you had the election of Barack Obama. Who did he pick? Or was actually given, and that was Joe Biden, because they felt that needed somebody on the ticket that had some foreign policy credentials. So you can see that in some respects we've understood that issue. Well, Kevin McCullough, who tends to be a Trump supporter, so recognize that that's going to come with some of the article here, says as President Donald Trump enters the second year of his second term, the most disruptive truth in America and in Washington, D.C. isn't his rhetoric, it's his results. Because he says for the first time in modern memory, the federal government has been forced to operate with total field awareness. What does he mean by that? Domestic strength paired with foreign resolve. Economic discipline paired with national security realism. As I said just a few minutes ago with Robert Knight, you may not like Donald Trump, you may not like what he said, but you've got to admit that wherever you look, he has had his finger in so many different areas, in part maybe because he was not president for 4 years and got to think this through. He says, okay, let's start at home. Let's look at domestic policy for just a minute. The so-called one big beautiful bill, the domestic agenda, paired with a regulatory and economic cleanout that has some dubbed the full-blown bureaucratic colony reset. That is, it has begun to take away, maybe not as much as Doge would like, maybe not as much as some people would want to really drain the swamp, because he brought some swampy people in with him. But nevertheless, you have to admit that has been something he's been able to do. Then you have something we talked about with certainly Robert Knight a minute ago, energy production that has been unleashed, not moralized. Because, again, remember the previous administration told us that, the Green New Deal, climate change, all of those kinds of issues. Then tax and regulatory certainty that has revived domestic investment. As he points out, capital hates confusion, and some of that has happened, obviously, during the tariffs, and we've talked about that before. But nevertheless, I think there is an opportunity for whether it's Main Street or Wall Street to begin to plan for the future based upon, of course, the domestic agenda of that one big, beautiful bill. And then this one other issue that we might talk about, which we haven't discussed too often, but is worth mentioning, departments are now forced to prove their usefulness. Cabinet secretaries are no longer ornamental. They are managers. Metrics matter. Dead weight gets identified, and hopefully some of those individuals and programs get scrapped. I say hopefully because sometimes it has happened, sometimes it doesn't. And so then let's move from, of course, the domestic scene to the international scene. And I'll just pick two. One is on Iran. He says the era of indulgence is over. Instead of pretending the regime can be bribed into good behavior, the Trump administration has dropped a policy sledgehammer on Tehran's nuclear ambitions. Again, for our younger audience, when Barack Obama was in office, there was an attempt to essentially, not just figuratively, but literally bribe Iran by, we now have, of course, pictures of these cargo planes full of U.S. dollars, and even the bribing in some cases that took place under Obama, that's not happening anymore. Red lines, he says, are no longer performance art. They're enforced boundaries. And again, there was a concern for many years about the fact that Iran is getting more and more powerful. It is the dominant force in the Middle East. And what are we going to do about it? Well, Donald Trump had an idea what to do about it, and Iran is a very different country today than it was this time a year ago. Very different, as we will probably talk about in the future in terms of some of the protests in the street. Then, if you don't think Iran is enough, let's talk about Venezuela. And again, points out the fact that for years, the world has indulged the grotesque theater of Nicolas Maduro's so-called presidency, a criminal enterprise masquerading as a government. Under Trump, the masquerade is ending. Diplomatic recognition has teeth again. Sanctions are targeted, enforced, and coordinated. And I can't remember when he wrote this, but this may have actually been written shortly thereafter, but doesn't really talk about the capture of Nicolas Maduro, so you can have that as well. And so what we have oftentimes dealt with in the past, and this is important, is to recognize that those who have come into office, whether Republicans or Democrats, whether presidents, members of Congress, whatever it might be, is to say, look, you know, we are dealing with the problem, but the problem is complicated. Failure is systemic. Change takes time. In other words, the word really that they are saying is this administration can't really accomplish what you want us to accomplish. And as Kevin McCullough says, this administration has rejected that premise. Trump's governing style is not academic, it's transactional and operational. That's why this moment matters beyond any single presidency. If one administration can simultaneously lower inflation pressure, restore energy dominance, rebuild the domestic industry, dismantle nuclear threats, and confront illegitimate regimes, then American people should never again accept selective competence from anyone who seeks power. Republican or Democrat, hawk or dove, progressive or conservative. We don't pay trillions of dollars for partial effort. We pay for outcomes. And so I think it's kind of interesting. He says we want our money back, not only because of the fraud, but because even those things which are supposedly done by competent individuals are only somewhat accomplished. And maybe we should not settle for half measures, and maybe we should demand meritocracy. Very good illustrations of one of the very important issues that we need to address here on Point of View. Let's take a break, though. We're going to spend some time talking with our good friend Christopher Reese. And if you are interested in some of these articles, especially this one by Kevin McCullough, I think it is a great illustration of how, in some respects, we have been told that, well, you just kind of have to live with fraud, abuse, and neglect. And we can't really get everything done because, after all, it's good enough for government work. Maybe not. I'll be right back.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday, in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, going to spend some time talking about New Year's resolutions. I know it's a week later, but I did do a commentary on January 1st on New Year resolutions. This one by Chris Reese, I think you'll appreciate as we work our way through that. And it's never too late to come up with resolutions, whether on January 1st or in this case, January 8th, or whenever you want to implement some of those. Let me just as a program note, though, mention that we will tomorrow have our roundtable discussion, and we'll probably come back to this issue of international law and Venezuela because I have two lawyers with me. We'll certainly be talking about Minnesota and Minneapolis. Also got a very good piece that we're going to post where we've already talked about this. I did a commentary a few days ago about Mitt Romney saying, tax the rich like me, and I did a commentary on it, but now we have two other individuals that have written about this, pointing out some of the problems with even the idea. And then, of course, we will get into a few other aspects of that. Penedexter's commentary, I know that Holly Randall already said she wanted to speak to. I'm sure Jeff Mateer will as well. So I hope that you will join us tomorrow. But in this last half hour, let's, if we can, get to a very good piece that appeared in the Worldview Bulletin newsletter. Now, you've heard me say before, I've subscribed to it since the very beginning of it. I have found wonderful articles and useful articles, and you've heard us from time to time interview some of the people that are writing there, and that has introduced us to some people doing worldview issues, apologetic issues, and the variety of others. If you are not subscribing to it, you can at least go to our website, pointofview.net, and we do have a place where you can read what we're going to be talking about, the soul-nourishing resolutions for the new year. But there's a place where you, if you already are a subscriber, can sign in, or a place where you can subscribe, all part of the Worldview Bulletin newsletter. Christopher Reese is a blogger, an expert in Christian worldview and apologetics, individual that has authored a number of things, including 100 Old Testament quotes by Jesus, how Christ used the Hebrew Scriptures. He's our founder and editor-in-chief of the Worldview Bulletin. And Christopher, welcome back to Point of View.
Thanks, Kerby. Happy New Year to you, and always a joy to be on with you.
I said Happy New Year to Robert Knight, and Happy New Year to you as well, Christopher. The first one is, as Christians, when we consider New Year's resolutions, we often think about reading the Bible more, praying more, and all that. All good. Attending church, being more involved, being a good Christian, all those kinds of things. But what you wanted to do is connect and maybe commend three other resolutions that usually don't make the list. Now, the first one is, I think, one we'll camp out for a little while. Practice attention management. Right off the bat, people are going to say, okay, what are we talking about here? Because that's not one I would have put on my New Year's resolutions list. So tell us more.
Right. Well, we hear a lot about time management. That comes up frequently, about managing our time better. But it seems to me that kind of in the cultural moment that we're in, we need to also think about attention management. And that basically just means that, we all know that we're kind of inundated by emails, videos, alerts, texts, all kinds of things connected to the devices that we use. And it can just be easy to kind of get lost in the ocean of those things and get distracted from the things that are really important. And so that's what I meant by attention management. We have to kind of be intentional about where we're going to kind of devote our thinking and our concentration to, and try to keep that focused on important things and not just sort of these more trivial things that, the algorithms feed to us.
Well, let's take a couple of ways in which to answer that. One is to guard our hearts, and we see that in the Proverbs. And you give us, of course, this idea that we are to guard our hearts from anything that will actually affect us in a negative way, and that's Proverbs 4. But, and I will focus on that probably to that. And of course, you also talk about 1 Thessalonians 5, firmly to what is good. So let's take the obvious one, to guard our hearts. There may be things that are drawing us into places we shouldn't go. There's certain things that are causing us to think in certain ways we shouldn't think. And as much as we need to hear that sermon from a pulpit or two, sometimes we don't. And it seems to me that pastors who spend time addressing Scripture, but not addressing the distractions that keep us from Scripture, really need to take that to heart. And so that's a resolution I would suggest for people that are pastors, preachers, teachers, Sunday school leaders, and also for all of us who have those devices in our hands and should really be preventing ourselves and protecting ourselves from some of that, shouldn't we?
That's right. A lot of the things that come through the devices, these are things that carry, often implicitly a kind of secular worldview. Sometimes it's sub-Christian, sometimes anti-Christian things. And so just sort of like everything else, we have to really think about that, take every thought captive, think about what's coming through, and make sure that, we're not sort of just kind of absorbing this by osmosis. The pastor and author Tim Keller would often talk about how culture is catechizing us. And, a lot of that happens sort of a lot of times without our knowing it. We're kind of like the fish in the water. We don't really know what the water is because we're kind of in it all the time. And so, so we need a counter catechism to the cultural catechism, and that involves, renewing our minds and, spending time in Scripture and absorbing that rather than just all the cultural stuff all the time.
Which gets us into the question of displacement, because you have so much time and effort spent in front of screens that it leads to your second one, and that is, you say, get more sleep. Now, I went to the doctor yesterday, and I think I got pretty good health, but one of the things he brought up, you bring up as well. Not for me, but for a lot of these young people who have these screens in front of them all the time, and since blue light from our phones and especially our particular most advanced phones and computer screens sometimes make it harder to get deep, restful sleep. And that's another reason to reevaluate some of your priorities. So in some respects, attention management and getting enough sleep are really important issues, aren't they?
That's true. I was amazed, and I mentioned at the beginning of this article that one study found that teenagers spend 9 hours a day on their phones, which is unbelievable. I mean, that's, it's hard to fathom that almost. And yes, definitely those screens can interrupt our sleep. Sleep is very important. If we don't get enough of it, it can lead to a lot of medical conditions. There's, kind of an old saying that pastors kind of pass around that says that sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is take a nap.
Right.
And that's true because, we are bodies and souls, and our bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, and we have to take care of them and do what's necessary, so they function well.
Well, again, if you think about this, Jesus was hungry. Jesus was tired. Jesus is asleep in a boat during a storm. I mean, it illustrates again that the physical world that we find ourselves in right now is one that requires opportunity to replenish. Our bodies are the temples of the Holy Spirit, which we learn in 1 Corinthians 6. And so that is the case. And one of the things that's interesting, Christopher, is people oftentimes when they hear about the various things that I write and produce and the various articles we have and everything else, they always say, well, he must never sleep. I said, you have no idea. All of that requires even more sleep probably than most people actually get. And so this lack of sleep, a very important issue, the lack of any kind of attention management important. When we come back, we have a third point. And again, Christopher Reese has given us an opportunity to maybe add one or two more, maybe all three of these particular resolutions to your New Year's resolution. Even though we're doing it a week later, it's still never too late to do the right thing and to do some things that are going to help you grow as a Christian, help you to keep healthy as an individual. So we'll come back and we've taken two. We'll take a third one. And if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to read all the details there, because he's got quite a number of endnotes which document some of the things he's saying, you can go to the website, pointofview.net, or go right to the Worldview Bulletin if you would like. We have a link there, and we'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Christopher Reese with us as we talk about his piece, Soul-Nourishing Resolutions for the New Year. It's part of the Worldview Bulletin newsletter. If you'd like to know more about that newsletter, we certainly have information about that on our website. The third point that you make is make new friends and deepen friendships. Now, you begin by talking about loneliness. By the way, we have a booklet, a biblical view on loneliness, in which I go all the way back to a very seminal book written by Robert Putnam called Bowling Alone, The Collapse and Revival of the American Community. Now, just a few minutes ago, I was talking about a piece that we have posted for our listeners about this idea of community in terms of some of the statements made by Zoran Mamdani, but you take on this issue of loneliness first of all. And by the way, he called it Bowling Alone because it used to be that people would join bowling leagues. And then over time, people began to be much more individualistic, and bowling leagues kind of went out of favor. You've got at least two different quotes and references to the issue of loneliness, some of which we've talked about on this program. And then you go on and talk about a very good piece that we've talked about before with Jay Kim, Analog Church, Why We Need Real People, Places, and Things in the Digital Age. But start off, Christopher, you point out that even before we had the COVID-19 pandemic, we had, I think you could oftentimes refer to it as a crisis of loneliness.
That's true. Yeah, we really do seem to have a kind of an epidemic of loneliness in most of the developed countries in the world. I think our devices have contributed to that to some extent. You know, we kind of can sometimes just immerse ourselves in these kind of virtual worlds, whether it's video games or, you know, some kind of online forum or what have you. And that can sort of keep us isolated from, you know, real people. So yeah, that's a major issue. I believe Japan has appointed a minister of loneliness in that country. You know, that's, you know, how seriously they're taking that. But yeah, it is a very major issue today.
You know, years ago, I wrote a book that was really looking ahead to the 21st century because I wrote it back in the 1990s, and I had a chapter on the crisis of loneliness. I wish I had a couple of the facts and figures you have now, because they have now argued that chronic loneliness is more dangerous to your health than smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And I've seen that statistic in a number of places, and you do a reference to it as well. You can go all the way back to Genesis 2. It is not good for man stand to be alone. So obviously there's a need for us to develop relationships. But let's get to the other part, because I mentioned Pastor Jay Kim. He's a pastor in the Silicon Valley area, wrote, of course, a piece about analog understanding what he calls the analog church. What we need is real people, places, and things. And so a problem that we even could begin to identify in the 1990s, and that's a quarter of a century ago, is now become even worse because of these devices, which sort of brings us back to the first one. Practice attention management, because if we are just glued to our devices and allowed that to be taking our attention, it just cuts out even more the possibility of any kind of friendships. And it used to be that we talked about the friendless American male. Matter of fact, that's the title of one of the books. But then I began, after I was speaking on that for a while, have women saying, well, it's true about me too, because I'm in the workplace and I don't have as many friends as I used to have. So this is, I think, why you felt that this should be the third and maybe the most extensive resolution you wrote about.
Right. Yeah, and you're right. And these things are all connected. The devices, the amount of sleep we get, the friendships. And one of the things that I appreciate that Jay Kim brought out is the difference between communicating and communing. So we can communicate with our devices. You know, we can send emails and text, and communicating is really about kind of exchanging information. But in order to commune, we really need to be with people, physically with people. And like he says, communing, it requires our attention, our empathy, our compassion, and that's where the real fellowship takes place.
Let's, if we can, just for a few minutes, talk about the fact that this particular article, Soul-Nourishing Resolutions for the New Year, is available. But I think there's some other great pieces that I might mention, and that is what I learned from 100 Atheists Who Converted to Christianity. You have a piece there about the Shroud of Turin. We've talked about, with John West, the Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. You've spent some time talking about whether or not we can have arguments for the existence of God with people like Doug Groothuis, even some of the things that Melissa Cain Travis writes about. There are just so many good articles that people would find. And so whether you're interested in worldview, whether you're interested in science, whether you're interested in knowing how to witness to your friends, neighbors, and coworkers, you really have quite a range of material. And I was certainly excited when you had Paul Copan and others beginning to talk about doing this newsletter. But you've been around for a while, and in some respects, you've been able to help people think through some of these issues biblically. And if nothing else, that's one of the other reasons why I commend people to consider getting a subscription to the Worldview Bulletin newsletter.
Yeah, I appreciate that very much. Yeah, we try to equip and inspire and inform believers with the Christian worldview, help them to understand it and to be able to defend it. And like you said, we try to bring some of the very best people writing on these topics, who are Christian thinkers and scholars, who are experts in their areas, and so try to bring some of the best insights and analyses of these issues, and hopefully just encourage the everyday believer to to have confidence in their faith and to see the truth and goodness and beauty of Christianity.
Well, again, I would encourage you to check it out. I mentioned Paul Gould. I mentioned also a couple of other people that have been involved with that project as well, because this is, I think, really important to understand the need for us to think biblically about these different issues. And, of course, we've mentioned our good friend Doug Groothuis, who's been on the program virtually in every studio that we've ever had. We go all the way back to the 1980s with him and others. And, of course, we had Craig Keener on recently and a variety of other individuals, and of course you as well writing about that. So first of all, I want to thank you for writing this, for editing it, and I thank you also for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks so much for having me again, Kerby. Appreciate the kind words, and likewise, I appreciate all the work you're doing, and I hope the Lord continues to bless it.
Well, again, we only have a minute or two left, so let me just mention real quickly that if you find yourself wanting to get some of the information, first of all, we have this piece by Robert Knight. We also have the piece by Christopher Reese. We have a number of different articles that relate to everything from international law to what happened in Minnesota, what has happened in Venezuela, and all sorts of other topics. You can find all of that at the website pointofview.net. Scroll down and you will see that there is an opportunity for you to also get the highlights of Point of View, the most recent one having to do with Jason Riley. I think you will appreciate that. And I might just mention, be watching for an email from me, because we do have a match on the table in case you would like to support this ministry. It's a great opportunity, so be looking for that. I want to thank everyone who's been a part of this program. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
The Bible tells us not to worry. And yet, there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes, even knowing what to pray can be difficult. And that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.